The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above the crash cart, and Katie Morrison's hands moved through the restocking ritual without thought. Saline bags, epinephrine vials, intubation tubes arranged in descending sizes like a surgeon's prayer beads. Her movements were too efficient, muscle memory from places the paperwork said never happened, from operations that had been officially erased, from a unit that no longer existed in any official record. The night shift at Seattle General in Atlanta was always this way, quiet enough to hear her own breathing, the way she preferred it. Nobody asked questions at 2:56 a.m. Nobody looked closely at the faded surgical scars on her forearms, the one shaped like shrapnel patterns if you knew what to look for. Her name badge clipped to her scrubs read Katie Morrison, RN. It didn't say Captain. It didn't say anything about the 7-unit citations, the 2 Purple Hearts, or the silver star folded in a Ziploc bag at the bottom of her locker. The scrubs themselves were faded past the point of navy, washed so many times they'd taken on the color of old denim. She wore them the same way she moved through the emergency department, with mechanical precision, without drawing attention, without asking for anything. The ambulance radio crackled to life, and her hand stilled for exactly 1 second. Incoming trauma, ETA for minutes. Male, 42, double amputee, bilateral above-knee amputations, sustained in 2009 IED blast. Currently unresponsive. Coded twice en route. Vitals unstable. GSW to abdomen during transport, active bleeding. We're running hot. Katie pulled a fresh pack from the overhead cabinet, her jaw moving slightly as she catalogued the complexity. Double amputee. Blast injury history. That meant shattered bones, vascular damage, potential crush syndrome, renal failure if they couldn't manage the fluids properly. The radio dispatcher's voice carried the particular edge that meant this patient wasn't expected to make it past the bay doors. Dr. William Pierce was already at the nurse's station, his white coat draped over a Prada suit that cost more than Katie made in a month. He was scrolling through his phone with the casual disinterest of someone who'd already made his decision. His fingers drummed against the Formica counter, tap, 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 a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to refusal. He didn't even look up when Katie wheeled the crash cart past, though his eyes tracked her for a moment, cataloging, dismissing, filing away something he couldn't quite articulate. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone trying to solve an equation with missing variables, someone trying to understand why the quiet night shift nurse moved like a combat medic during trauma calls. The doors burst open at exactly 2:51 a.m., and the ambulance team came through like a small military unit, coordinated, urgent, practiced. Sergeant Marcus Reid was strapped to the gurney, his skin the color of old chalk, his remaining leg wrapped in trauma dressings that were already soaking through with dark blood. The paramedic called out the vitals like he was reciting a prayer nobody was going to answer, BP 68/42 and dropping, heart rate 138, respiratory distress, O2 sat 84%. Katie moved toward the trauma bay without being told, her hands already pulling supplies before the paramedics finished their handoff. Trauma Bay 3, Pierce called out, his voice carrying the tone of someone offering directions to a funeral. Get him stable for transport to intensive care if he stabilizes. Probably won't. Katie didn't respond. She was already establishing her own mental checklist, massive transfusion protocol, surgical airway if they couldn't maintain his oxygen, fluid resuscitation starting immediately. The patient's chart was being shoved toward her by one of the ER techs, and she caught it one-handed while pulling on trauma gloves with the other. Her fingers moved like they'd done this 1,000 times. They had. The next thing she noticed was the notation on the intake form. Under Patient Military History, someone had written, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Unit patch found in belongings. Katie's hand stopped moving for approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds was all the time she had. The defibrillator was chirping because Marcus's rhythm was deteriorating again, and there was no space in her head for anything except the immediate calculus of trauma medicine. Get him through this moment. Get him to the next one. The rest would sort itself out or it wouldn't. What Katie didn't realize yet was that Dr. Pierce was watching her from the observation window, specifically watching the way her breathing had changed, the way her entire body posture had shifted from subservient to something else entirely. Something territorial. Something that suggested maybe this wasn't just another disposable night shift patient. Pierce's hand was already moving toward his phone. But before his fingers connected with the screen, Katie rolled the crash cart into Trauma Bay 3, and the fluorescent lights caught the edge of the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, barely visible, the kind of thing you only saw if you were looking for it. The 2nd Battalion patch. Dark Horse. The same patch as the man bleeding out on the gurney in front of her. The same patch as the operation Pierce had no clearance to know about. The same patch that meant Captain Katie Morrison was about to make some very complicated decisions about whether protocol mattered more than the Marine who was currently flatlining in front of her, the Marine whose blood type was scrawled on his chart, the Marine who had a unit patch in his belongings that matched the one sewn inside her jacket. Pierce made the call anyway. "Yeah, it's me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone about to make a problem disappear. "Get me Dr. Harrison. Tell him we've got an incoming that's going to need more resources than we can justify. I'm going to need a medical reason for refusal." The ambulance radio was still crackling with incoming calls. Somewhere in the hospital, other patients were arriving, other crises were unfolding, other doctors were making other decisions. Katie's world had narrowed down to exactly 2,847 milliliters of blood that needed to stay inside Marcus Reid's body, and everything else became noise. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she pushed the intubation tube down his throat with practiced precision, her hand steady as surgical lasers, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. The O2 monitor climbed, 64, 72, 79, climbing, stabilizing. Her voice cut through the chaos in the bay, not loud, just certain, the voice of someone who'd done this before under worse conditions. "Large bore access, bilateral. Let's run the massive transfusion protocol. Type O negative until crossmatch comes back. Get me a surgical team down here in 5 minutes or we're going to lose him." The ER tech nodded without hesitation. That was the other thing about Katie Morrison, nobody questioned her when she talked like that, even though her name badge said RN and her scrubs were faded past recognition. Something in her voice suggested she had clearance to demand things. The next doctor came in, Dr. Harrison, his brow furrowed as Pierce had clearly briefed him. He stepped up to the monitors, looked at the numbers, and stepped back. "Too much resource allocation for the probability of successful outcome," Harrison said. "Someone else take this case." Katie didn't look up from the 4 placement. She was too busy watching Marcus's vitals climb toward something resembling stability. The nurse call button went out anyway, and the page came back, Dr. Sterling, Dr. Chen, Dr. Yardley, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Reeves, Dr. Clark. 7 names. 7 doctors that Pierce had apparently called before even understanding what the case was. 7 refusals stacked on top of each other like a calculated pattern, like the kind of thing someone did when they were very deliberately making sure a patient became everyone's problem and therefore nobody's responsibility. Katie knew exactly what was happening. She'd seen institutional cowardice before. She'd seen it dressed up in medical language and administrative protocol. She'd seen it in places where talking about it had gotten people killed. She also knew that she was the only one in that emergency department who was going to stand between Marcus Reid and the systematic, bureaucratic decision to let him die. The question was whether anyone would notice that she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. Outside the trauma bay, through the observation window, Dr. Pierce was making another phone call, his satisfaction visible in the set of his shoulders. He'd managed to create a situation where the patient was now toxic, no doctor wanted to touch him, which meant no doctor was responsible if he died. It was a perfect mechanism for culpability dissolution. What Pierce didn't know was that Katie had already been documenting the pattern of medication discrepancies in his cases for the last 3 months. He didn't know she'd noticed the opioids logged out but never delivered to patients, the gaps in the pharmacy records, the numbers that didn't add up. And he definitely didn't know that the moment he'd pushed her toward this moment, he'd made himself visible to someone who had been trained by the military to notice patterns of institutional corruption. All of that would come later. For now, there was just the immediate calculus: one Marine, one cardiac monitor climbing toward stability, one captain in a faded nurse's uniform who'd made a very quiet decision to hold the line. The ventilator wheezed. The monitors beeped. And somewhere above Seattle General, the stars held their breath, waiting to see if the quiet one would survive the night. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had no idea what he'd just activated. The conference room at Seattle General smelled like stale coffee and the particular sterile air that comes from 1,000 meetings held in spaces without windows. 30 residents sat in tiered rows, their white coats pressed and pristine, their attention split between tablets and the figure standing at the lectern. Dr. Pierce held up a chart, Marcus Reid's chart, like a fisherman displaying his catch. The morning light from the projection screen caught the pages as he fanned them, a gesture that might have been casual if his smile wasn't already sharpening. "Notice the documentation here," Pierce said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly how a room would respond. "Nurse Morrison has taken it upon herself to chart every minute detail of a patient presentation that, frankly, does not warrant this level of investment." He tapped the pages. Single amputee progressing to bilateral amputation. Traumatic brain injury with poor prognosis. No family support system documented. No realistic pathway to functional recovery. The residents leaned forward. This was the kind of teaching moment they'd been trained to recognize, a case study in resource allocation, in clinical decision-making stripped of sentiment. Pierce had structured it perfectly. "This," he continued, holding up one page with Katie's handwriting filling every margin, "is what happens when bleeding hearts override clinical judgment. When emotional overinvolvement replaces evidence-based medicine. Our little Florence Nightingale here thinks feelings trump facts." He smiled at his own phrasing, and the laughter came like a wave, not cruel exactly, but the kind of laughter that hardens into consensus. Residents scribbled notes. One nodded knowingly to her neighbor. In the back of the room, Katie Morrison stood with her arms crossed. She'd arrived late on purpose, positioned herself where she could leave without drawing attention. She wore her scrubs like armor, navy blue, wrinkled from a 12-hour shift that had technically ended 2 hours ago, and she'd come to grand rounds anyway because that's what nurses did. They showed up. They listened. They absorbed the verdict. But her eyes tracked Pierce like a rifle scope tracking movement. Not angry. Not even particularly focused on his face. Just watching. The kind of watching that military personnel recognized as threat assessment. The kind that made the hindbrain whisper warnings. Pierce was too busy playing to his audience to notice. "The fundamental issue," he said, gesturing with the chart, "is knowing when to stop. When to recognize that heroic measures become cruel measures." Nurse Morrison charted 17 separate interventions on a patient who has a less than 5% chance of meaningful recovery. 5%. That's not medicine. That's theater. He set the chart down on the lectern with the finality of a verdict. And it's expensive theater. The room stayed quiet for 3 seconds. Then someone coughed. Then someone else shifted in their seat. The moment stretched thin and tight. Katie waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Then she spoke, and her voice didn't come from a nurse's throat. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had called out coordinates under fire and held perimeter in the dark. Hopeless is a diagnosis made by people who've never had to carry someone 6 miles under fire. The room snapped into focus. 30 residents turned in their seats. Pierce's jaw tightened. But Katie was already moving, not rushing, just turning with the kind of controlled precision that made you understand she'd never been confused about where the exits were. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a lock engaging. Silence filled the conference room the way it fills a place after a detonation. Residents exchanged glances. Pierce picked up his chart again, his movement slightly sharper now, and continued as if nothing had happened. But his voice had changed. The confidence was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. He'd expected deference. He'd expected the nurse to absorb the humiliation and carry it home in her shoulders, the way they always did. That afternoon, Katie found herself at the vending machine on the 4th floor, feeding in exact change with the methodical focus of someone counting down something. Pierce appeared from the corridor with 2 residents flanking him, a deliberate choice, bringing witnesses. He was learning that isolation wasn't working. Still playing soldier, Katie. His tone was light, designed to sound good-natured to anyone passing by. This is a hospital, not a battlefield. Maybe you should stick to bedpans. That's where nurses belong. She pushed the button for black coffee. 40 cents dropped, mechanical and satisfying. The cup dispensed with a hiss of steam. She didn't turn to look at him. I'm being serious, Pierce continued, moving closer now that she wasn't responding. One more procedure beyond your scope, and security will escort you out. I've talked to people. Your references aren't what you think they are. He was holding something, a clipboard, the narcotics log from the medication room. His hand was steady, but something in his posture had shifted. He was no longer certain she'd break. Katie retrieved her coffee and turned to leave. As she passed him, she didn't acknowledge him at all. Her shoulder nearly brushed his and he stepped back, which was the real victory in the moment. The residents noticed that too. The attending had flinched. The medication room door was locked, but Katie had the code. 1-1-2-4, November, first deployment, 24 days before the explosion. She'd used this code every day for 2 years without thinking about it, just fingers moving through the pattern. But now, standing in the room with its rows of locked drawers and its fluorescent hum that made your teeth itch, she pulled out her phone. The controlled substance log lay open on the counter. 2 years of entries. She photographed each page, careful with the angles, making sure the dates and signatures were clear. The discrepancies were obvious once you knew to look for them. Oxycodone entries that didn't match patient charts. Morphine vials signed out but never charted to a single patient. Fentanyl patches documented as administered and then nothing. No pain scores updated. No vital sign changes that would suggest administration. Just vanished. She'd learned to notice patterns like this in places where attention to detail kept people alive. Baghdad had been a good teacher. The hospital was just slower about it. She emailed the images to herself. Then deleted the email from the phone sent folder. Muscle memory took over, covering tracks, leaving no evidence that she'd ever been here, just a nurse doing her job. At home that night, Katie sat at the kitchen table with her 14-year-old son across from her. Marcus, her son, not the patient, though that wasn't her son's name either anymore because he'd asked to change it when she'd moved them off base, was finishing homework. Algebra. Completely ordinary. He glanced up at her. You okay, Mom? You've been quiet. Just a long shift, baby. He accepted that. He was used to her silences, the way she sometimes stared past him at nothing. He'd grown up with a mother who wasn't fully present in rooms, who always seemed to be calculating something just outside his range. He didn't know why. He wouldn't know why until much later, and even then he wouldn't know everything. But he'd learned to respect the silences. Katie excused herself and went to her bedroom closet. Winter coats hung from the rod, good coats, practical. Under them, shoved to the back and covered with a blanket, was a showbox. Old cardboard, the kind that had started disintegrating at the edges years ago. She opened it without letting herself think about what was inside. Silver star. Purple heart. Combat action ribbon. All of them dated from before she was Katie Morrison, nurse. From when she was Captain Catherine Morrison, medevac pilot, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. From before the Pentagon had decided that what happened in Fallujah couldn't have happened because there was no official record of female combat pilots flying extraction missions. Before she was supposed to vanish into civilian life and never speak of it again. She closed the box without touching any of the medals. Just looked at them. Just let herself remember that Captain Catherine Morrison had existed. That she'd been real. That she'd carried people 6 miles under fire and that some of them had lived. Her phone buzzed. Hospital alert. Marcus Reid's vitals declining. She wasn't scheduled for 6 hours. She grabbed her keys anyway, the kind of decision that military people made without hesitation, the choice to show up when you were needed. But Pierce was already moving against her? That night, at 2100 hours, he made a call to the overflow wing administrator. By 2300, a transfer order had been processed with a signature that looked almost legitimate if you didn't examine it too carefully. Marcus Reid, deemed stable enough for lower acuity care, would be moved to the overflow wing during the night shift. Not Katie's wing. Not under her documentation. It was a strategic move, and for the first time, Pierce was thinking like someone who understood exactly what he was fighting. He'd stopped treating this like a simple power dynamic. He'd started treating it like something that required architecture. What he still didn't understand was exactly who he was strategizing against. Katie's break lasted 16 minutes. She didn't time it, but the hospital clock above the nurse's station was the kind of institutional fixture that demanded to be read, and she'd learned long ago to measure everything in increments: medications, vitals, the space between when a heart stopped and when it could be restarted. 300 seconds to sit in the staff lounge, drink coffee that tasted like burnt rubber filtered through regret, and think about Sergeant Marcus Reid lying in Trauma Bay 3 with both legs ending just below the hip and a traumatic brain injury that had stolen more than his mobility. She found him awake at 0247, which meant he'd been awake for hours. The monitors beside his bed showed a steady rhythm, nothing alarming, nothing that would spike adrenaline through the unit. His dark eyes tracked her as she entered, and there was something in that tracking that caught her attention. Not recognition. Something else. Something like the sensation of reaching for a word that existed somewhere in the back of your mind but refused to surface, the way a dream fragments the second you wake up. "Hey, Sarge," she said, keeping her voice level as she adjusted the 4-line running into his left arm. "You need anything?" "Can't sleep," he said. His voice was hoarse, damaged by the intubation they'd done during transport. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm there. But I can't remember where there is." Katie checked his oxygen saturation without looking at his face. 94%. Good. She wrote it on her mental tally of details that had nothing to do with Dr. Pierce and everything to do with keeping this man alive. "The doctors said that's normal with TBI," she said. "Memory consolidation takes time." "That's not it." Marcus shifted his weight, and the morphine drip slowed his movements into something like swimming. "There's something I'm supposed to remember. Something important. A name." Or, he paused, frustration tightening his jaw. "It's like standing in a dark room and knowing there's a door, but you can't find the handle." Katie's hand stilled on the 4-line. She kept her breathing steady, kept her face neutral. Inside, something that had been held at a precise military temperature for 8 years shifted slightly. "Could be the medication," she said. "Could be the brain injury. Could be both." "There's something else," Marcus continued. His eyes were fixed on her now, really looking at her, and she could see him trying to push through the chemical fog of painkillers to reach something solid. "In Baghdad. There was someone. A moment. I remember dirt and fire and," he stopped. "And hands. Pulling me. But the face is gone. Just gone." Katie straightened the blanket over his legs, both of them now, the empty space where limbs had been reduced to a topographic feature of his body. "Your mind's protecting you," she said. "Sometimes that's what it does. It locks things away until you're ready." "What if I'm never ready?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she checked his vitals one more time and made notes on a chart in her careful, precise handwriting. Time 0251. O2 sat 94%. HR 68. BP 11876. Neurologically stable but confused. Patient expressing frustration regarding memory loss. Everything clinical. Everything true. Nothing about the way her heart had just cracked a millimeter wider. She was halfway through the shift when the emptiness registered. Katie came back at 0245, not scheduled, but circling because that's what you did when you had a patient whose name you'd carried through Baghdad like a physical wound, and Baghdad had carried your name tattooed across his forearm. The night shift nurse at the desk had her head down, and the trauma bays showed their usual landscape of monitors and sleeping patients. But when Katie glanced at Trauma Bay 3, the monitors were dark. The bed was empty. The equipment was gone. She stopped moving. The silence in her chest was louder than the ventilators. Louder than the monitors. Louder than the alarms that went off at regular intervals when someone coded or crashed or simply stopped being stable. "Where's Reid?" She didn't make it a question. The night shift nurse, Jenkins, probably 24, still new enough to flinch when Katie spoke, looked up. "Transfer." Dr. Pierce ordered it around midnight. Katie moved to the chart station without responding. The tablet showed what she'd already deduced. Sergeant Marcus Reid, bed status changed from Trauma Bay 3 to Overflow Wing, Bed 7C annotation, bed management optimization. Physician order, Dr. James Pierce. Time, 003 hours. Overflow Wing. The section built in the late 80s when hospital administration had finally accepted that bodies kept arriving faster than beds were vacated. Overflow was technically equipped for monitoring. It had call buttons and oxygen lines and the bare mechanics of critical care, but it existed at the edge of everything. Response times there ran 3 to 4 minutes longer than the main units. Nursing ratios were thinner. It was where you sent patients when you were managing space, not saving lives. It was where Dr. Pierce had placed a freshly traumatized double amputee with a deteriorating neurological picture when the man's care had exposed 7 doctors' refusals in writing. Katie's jaw clenched. Not visibly. Not in any way that Jenkins could read. She simply closed the tablet and moved toward the exit. "Hey," Jenkins called after her. "Heads up, Pierce flagged you as not assigned to that patient anymore. Said you could talk to him if you needed to, but you're not primary care going forward." Katie paused at the threshold between the main unit and the corridor. Not assigned. The phrase hung in the air like something that had weight. Who's primary? Resident on rotation. Some new guy named Costianos. Katie nodded and walked. The overflow wing was quieter. That was the first thing you noticed. Not peaceful quiet. Inadequate quiet. The kind of quiet that existed because there wasn't enough staff to generate the usual rhythm of hospital work. One nurse sat at a desk meant for 3, and she didn't look up when Katie approached. Katie could read the shift report from the sign-in log, 3 RNs covering 12 beds. That meant each nurse had 4 patients. One of those 4 could be coding while the other 3 were medically stable, and the response would still be delayed by the architecture of the unit itself. "Sergeant Reid," Katie said. "Bed 7C." The nurse glanced up. Her name tag read Ramirez. She looked exhausted in the way that night shift did to people, hollowed out and running on coffee that had been brewed 6 hours ago. "You his doctor?" "No." Ramirez pointed down the corridor without asking anything else. The kind of gesture that meant either she didn't care or she'd already stopped trying to understand the hospital's permission structure. Bed 7C was at the far end, positioned where the hallway curved and the lighting got worse. Katie could see it from 20 yards away, the bed with its single occupant, the monitors casting their blue glow onto his face. She walked without hurrying. No need to rush. Rushing would trigger observation. Instead, she moved with the purpose of someone checking on a patient in the normal course of her shift, which was a fiction, but a fiction she could maintain for another few seconds. Marcus's eyes were open when she entered the room. The oxygen mask covered the lower half of his face, and his chest was moving in a pattern that Katie's training recognized immediately, rapid and shallow. Tachypneic. Not quite gasping, but approaching it. She checked the monitor first. Heart rate 102. Respiratory rate 28. Oxygen saturation 91%. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction, each one drifting toward territory that would, left alone long enough, require intervention. "Where have you been?" Marcus asked. His voice was muffled by the mask, but she could hear the panic underneath. "I woke up and everything was different. They moved me," they said. "I'm here now," Katie said. She was already checking the fall line, verifying the oxygen setup, reading the chart that hung on the bed. The last vital signs entry was 2 hours old. No one had been in to check on him since the transfer. Tension pneumothorax, her training said. The pattern of his breathing, the rising heart rate, the dropped oxygen. It was building. A collapsed lung with air trapped in the pleural space, creating pressure that prevented the lung from re-expanding. You could die from it. People did die from it, sometimes very quickly, sometimes in a hospital bed with monitors showing all the data needed to prevent the outcome. She was reaching for the call button when Marcus's oxygen saturation dropped. 90. 88. His eyes widened, and he tried to sit forward, but the pain stopped him. His lips were beginning to turn blue at the edges. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "Katie." He said her name. It was the wrong moment for recognition, for that 3-second flash of memory accessing something through the fog of medications and injury and 8 years of erased history. But his eyes found her face, really found it, and something ancient and fractured in his expression shifted into place. He knew. Not everything, not yet, not with the clarity of someone whose hippocampus wasn't actively hemorrhaging. But something. Enough. Katie hit the code button. The response should have taken 4 minutes. Katie knew this because she'd watched the system, had observed how long it took from the moment a hand pressed the wall-mounted emergency alert until the crash team appeared with their cart and their protocols and their ability to do the specific interventions that separated living from dead. 4 minutes was an eternity in respiratory distress. 4 minutes was long enough for a saturation drop from 90 to 70. 4 minutes was long enough to cause permanent neurological damage if the hypoxia extended to the brain. She was bagging him, mask sealed over his nose and mouth, her hands moving with the kind of automaticity that came from muscle memory trained into flesh, when the first footsteps appeared in the doorway. Not the crash cart. Not the respiratory therapist with the intubation equipment. Just Dr. Pierce, and he was moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who was no longer trying to strategize. He was trying to control the narrative, and the narrative was unraveling. "Step aside," Pierce said. His voice had that specific cadence of absolute authority that hospital hierarchy had taught him he possessed. "This patient has a do not resuscitate order." Katie continued bagging. 1 squeeze. 2. The rhythm was perfect. The oxygen was flowing. She didn't look at him. "Did you hear me, Ms. Morrison?" She was Katie now, not Nurse Morrison. Never a good sign in hospital code speak. "Check the chart," Katie said. Her voice was flat in the way that gave nothing away. "There is no DNR." Pierce moved to the bed, and for a moment Katie thought he would physically try to stop her from bagging. His hand came up, and time did that weird thing where it expanded. She could see every detail, the platinum wedding band that probably cost more than she made in a month, the manicure that looked fresh, the expression on his face that suggested he was genuinely uncertain about whether hospital rules would allow him to physically prevent her from resuscitating a patient. The monitors screamed. Heart rate 148. Oxygen saturation 62%. The room had acquired the specific chaos of a patient actively dying despite everyone in it being trained to prevent exactly this outcome. The difference was that one of them was trying to prevent it while the other stood in the doorway, hand raised, calculating probabilities that should have involved only medicine but were actually involving something else, career implications and exposure and the way that saving this particular patient might pull a thread that unraveled other things. Marcus's eyes rolled back. The flat line on the monitor began its terrible song, the long-sustained scream of cardiac arrest. Asystole. Pierce opened his mouth. Katie could see him preparing to speak, preparing to call the code, preparing to manage the moment with the authority that he'd been gathering for the entire night shift, the entire chain of refusals, The entire architecture of a plan that had gotten him this far only to be interrupted by a woman in scrubs who'd pushed back once during grand rounds and was pushing back now in a way that was starting to feel less like insubordination and more like something he couldn't actually stop. Katie grabbed the trauma shears from the crash cart that hadn't arrived yet but should have, that was 3 minutes away and closing. The metal was cold in her hand. She looked at Pierce once, met his eyes with something that wasn't anger and wasn't fear and wasn't anything that could be managed through administrative action or phone calls or the careful cultivation of allies who owed favors. Then she moved. The blade of the shears was already between Marcus's ribs before the first person in the hallway realized what was happening. The heart monitor flatlined at 0300 exactly. 3 beeps, then a straight line across the screen like a final sentence. Marcus Reid's chest stopped moving. His pupils dilated. The overflow wing skeleton crew, a single resident and 2 nursing assistants, froze. One of them called a code. Nobody moved toward the crash cart. Katie heard it from the hallway. She was 3 floors up, charting in the break room, when the code tone crackled through the intercom. Her hand knew before her mind did. By the time the announcement finished, she was already moving. The crash cart sat outside Trauma Bay 2, 30 feet from where Marcus lay in that understaffed wing. Dr. Pierce stood at the nurse's station, phone pressed to his ear, his back to the hallway. He didn't see her coming. She didn't ask permission. Didn't page a doctor. Didn't wait for a supervising physician to authorize what she was about to do. Katie simply grabbed the stainless steel cart and ran. The wheel squeaked across tile like a warning. The sound echoed down the corridor. "Katie, stop." Pierce's voice. Sharp. Too late. Marcus Reid lay with his eyes open and empty. Cyanotic. The resident was running compressions but the pressure readings weren't climbing. No rhythm. No response. 70 seconds of cardiac arrest already. Every second cost neurons. Cost memories. Cost the possibility of the man she'd carried through fire ever remembering her name. Katie pulled a scalpel from the crash cart. The blade caught the fluorescent light. Her hands moved through the space between conscious thought and muscle memory, the same hands that had opened 3 chests in Baghdad when the medevac was 20 minutes out and the bleeding wouldn't stop. The same hands that knew exactly where the 4th and 5th intercostal spaces met the mid-axillary line. She didn't hesitate. Couldn't afford to. The blade went between his ribs. The incision was clean. Practiced. She could smell the copper of blood mixing with antiseptic, and underneath that, something else, fear. The resident stepped back. The 2 nursing assistants made sounds they didn't have words for. Blood sprayed across her scrubs in a pattern that looked like a map of somewhere she'd been before. Katie's fingers found the pericardium. She opened it with the precision of a safecracker opening a vault. Fluid released. Pressure lifted. She reached in and felt the ventricles, a heart that had been squeezed too tight by its own swelling, by fluid, by the weight of being a broken thing in a broken system. Her hand closed around it. The muscle was warm. Slick. Unresponsive. She began manual massage. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Not the gentle compressions of protocol. Real pressure. Real force. The kind of pressure that came from knowing the difference between a textbook and a body that wants to live. 70 seconds. 80. The resident started to move toward her. Katie spoke without looking up. Get a 7.5 tube and RSI meds. Now. The resident ran. 90 seconds. Katie's forearm was deep in Marcus Reid's chest cavity. Blood coated her to the elbow. The hallway had filled with people now, staff stopping, staring, unable to move. The sight of a nurse in a combat knife stance, her arm literally inside a man's chest, performing a procedure that belonged in a trauma surgery bay, not a hallway. 100 seconds. The heart gasped. It was the only word for it. A single, violent contraction that felt like the organ finally remembering how to fight. Katie felt it against her palm. Felt the electrical current run through the tissue like a muscle remembering its purpose. The monitor beeped once. Then again. Then a rhythm emerged. Irregular at first. Chaotic. Then something closer to order. The O2 sat climbed. 68. 72. 81. The systolic pressure rose from nothing to 68. Then 74. The resident returned with the intubation kit. Katie withdrew her hand and stepped back. The blood was already drying on her scrubs in a pattern that looked like calligraphy in a language she'd learned in a desert. "Get him upstairs," she said. Her voice was level. Almost bored. "ICU. Cardiothoracic consult. Now." The team moved. The moment shattered into action. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Pierce stood at the nurse's station. Phone still pressed to his ear. He'd watched the entire procedure without moving. Without speaking. His face was the color of fresh plaster. When he saw Katie look up, he turned away and continued his conversation in a voice so low it blended with the ventilator hum. She saw him make the first call at 0320. Hospital board chairman. She didn't know what he said, but she watched his lips move. The words no. Violation. Scope of practice. Unauthorized. Then the second call at 0340, Georgia Nursing Board. Then a third at 0400, phone number from his personal cell, someone he kept on retainer, an investigator with a surname that belonged to billionaires and litigation. Then the fourth call at 0423, just as the sun was beginning to separate itself from the horizon. This one lasted longer. Pierce's voice was different. Flatter. Almost reverent. Like he was reading a phone number from a document that had been classified once, then declassified, then classified again. Katie didn't hear what he said, but she watched his jaw clench when whoever answered responded. She watched him listen. Watched him hang up and set the phone on the desk like it had burned him. The number he'd called didn't ring back. But something else happened instead. Something invisible. Something that moved through Fort Meade and the National Security Agency, triggering alarms that had been waiting 17 years to be activated by that sequence of digits. Alarms that had Captain Katie Morrison's name on them, flagged for monitoring, tied to an operation that never happened, performed by a soldier who'd been legally erased. Katie walked to the break room and sat down in front of the time clock. She didn't leave. She could have. She could have walked out at 0500 or 0600 or anytime before 0800. She could have vanished into the civilian infrastructure she'd been ordered into, disappeared the way they'd taught her to disappear in Fallujah. Instead, she waited. Security arrived at 0755. Two guards she'd nodded at every shift for 18 months. They didn't make eye contact. They told her to stand. They told her she was suspended pending investigation. They told her to surrender her badge. They told her she was being escorted from the building and not to return pending the outcome of the disciplinary hearing. They told her the Georgia Nursing Board had already received a complaint. They told her Dr. Pierce had evidence of practicing beyond her scope of license and performing unauthorized invasive procedures without physician oversight. Katie gave them her badge. She signed the paperwork. She didn't speak. She'd learned 17 years ago that silence was the only weapon that worked in rooms like this. Silence and the knowledge that whoever was reading the charges already believed them. The parking lot was wet from rain that had fallen during the night shift. She stood in it for 2 minutes, letting it soak into her scrubs. The blood was already drying. Already turning brown. She thought about Marcus Reid's heart contracting in her palm. About the rhythm returning. About the fact that he'd survive now, that he'd wake up, that he'd spend the next 50 years walking through civilian life with no memory of the woman who'd opened his chest in a hallway. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table while the sun cleared the trees outside her window. The scrubs stuck to her skin. She didn't change them. She sat there with her hands folded and let the dried blood flake onto the wood grain like old photographs. Her son found her like that at 1400. 14 years old and smart enough to know that something fundamental had changed. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. His mother was staring at the wall. Her scrubs were stained rust brown. Her hair was in a knot that had fallen apart. Her face had the expression of someone who'd been given a diagnosis with no cure date. He didn't ask what happened at first. He just sat down across from her. Katie's hands were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. From the specific kind of trembling that came when your entire identity was being disassembled in real time and you couldn't do anything but watch it happen. The Pentagon had erased her once. Told her the operation in Baghdad never happened. Told her the 17 Marines she'd carried through fire were a classified hallucination. Ordered her into civilian life as Katie Morrison, registered nurse, with no history before this place, no records of Captain Katie Morrison, no proof that Valkyrie 6 had ever existed. She'd obeyed. 17 years of obeying. And it hadn't been enough. Mom. Her son's voice was small. What happened? She looked at him. She tried to speak. The words were stuck somewhere between her lungs and her throat, trapped in the same place where she'd learned to keep secrets. Where she'd learned to be invisible. The tears came suddenly. Not gentle. Not quiet. The kind of tears that belonged to someone who'd been drowning and had finally stopped trying to swim. Her son didn't move. He just watched his mother break apart at the kitchen table while the morning light moved across the wall behind them. For the first time in 17 years, Katie Morrison cried where someone could see her cry. Neither of them knew that in 14 hours, a Marine captain would walk into a hospital administrator's office with a showbox that contained the evidence of everything she'd buried. Neither of them knew that her son's instinct to tell the truth would trigger a sequence of events that had been waiting in the bureaucratic architecture of the Pentagon since the day she was ordered to vanish. Neither of them knew that everything about to change had already changed. The phone in the hallway sat silent. But somewhere in Fort Meade, alarm bells were ringing. Security's hand on her elbow was professional. Firm. The kind of touch that wasn't a request. Katie Morrison didn't resist. She never did. At 0800, Dr. Pierce stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, watching her badge get scanned one final time before the light turned red. Practicing beyond scope, he said, loud enough for the morning shift to hear. Unauthorized procedures. We have standards here. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Katie's scrubs still had Marcus Reid's blood on them, she'd been too numb to change. The security guard walked her to the parking lot. Rain hammered the concrete like applause that nobody wanted. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. What Pierce didn't know, what his phone calls before dawn hadn't uncovered, was that somewhere in a federal database, Captain Katie Morrison's real records were locked behind classification codes that made civilian oversight impossible. He triggered something. He just didn't know it yet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at home. Her son, Daniel, 14 years old with his mother's dark eyes, found her sitting at the kitchen table at 14:30 that afternoon. She was still in her scrubs. Still wearing Marcus Reid's blood like a confession. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Daniel didn't say anything. He just left. And came back 15 minutes later with a showbox from the closet in her bedroom, the one she'd told him never to open, never to mention, never to acknowledge existed. He placed it on the table in front of her. Whatever they said you did, he said, they need to see what you actually are. The next morning at 0900, that showbox sat on the polished mahogany table in the hospital administrator's office, and Daniel sat beside his mother as the board members filed in. 8 of them. All wearing the kind of expressions that said they'd already made their decision. Katie Morrison sat motionless. Her composure was a weapon they couldn't identify yet. Her son opened the showbox. The medals caught the light like bullets. He spilled them across the table one at a time. Combat Action Ribbon, he said, reading the citation his mother had never shown him. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. And my mom says this one is the big one. He held up the silver star. The room went dead silent. She got these before you decided she was just a nurse. She's Captain Katie Morrison. And you fired her for saving a life. The board chairman's face went pale. The hospital's legal counsel leaned back in his chair like he'd been struck. And then the doors opened. It wasn't security this time. It was Marcus Reid's brother, Captain James Reid, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Camp Lezon, dressed in dress blues because he'd come straight from base. He'd been waiting in the hallway. He'd heard every word. He walked directly to Katie's jacket, hanging on the back of her chair, and pulled the lining open. The faded 2nd Battalion unit patch was still there. Frayed at the edges. Worn from 16 years of existence. He whispered, "Valkyrie 6. Just those 2 words. The silence after them was the kind that happens when someone recognizes a ghost. Then a voice from the corner. Soft. Measured. A 2-star general who'd been sitting quietly in the back of the room this whole time stood up. He'd been invited by the Pentagon's investigator, the one Dr. Pierce's complaint had triggered. Read the citation, the general said. Not a request. A command. A Marine captain in the room, not James Reid, but Captain Sarah Halloway, attached to the VA Inspector General's office, picked up the silver star and began reading aloud. For extraordinary heroism under fire, Captain Morrison evacuated 17 wounded Marines while under sustained hostile fire in Fallujah, Jolan District, January 2009. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through like a blade. This is completely irrelevant to her gross violation of scope of practice and hospital protocol. His voice was rising. Desperation bleeding through. What she did last night was illegal. Criminal, potentially. Her credentials, the 2-star general stood. He didn't say anything. He just saluted. Not the board members. Not the administrator. He saluted the silver star. He saluted the Purple Hearts. The room understood what that meant. Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse they could fire. Katie Morrison was a captain they'd tried to silence, and the Pentagon had just sent a general to make sure everyone in that room understood the difference. Within the hour, a Pentagon investigator named Chen arrived with a leather portfolio and an expression like polished steel. Everyone assumed he was there to examine Katie's credentials. Instead, he pulled Dr. Pierce's own complaint from his briefcase, the one Pierce had filed demanding a full audit of controlled substances and medication logs in the emergency department. The audit he'd weaponized against Katie. The same audit that had triggered those silent alarms at Fort Meade. Dr. Pierce, Chen said, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who'd reviewed classified materials, we need to talk about $340,000 in missing medications. We need to talk about your supplier network. We need to talk about the kickbacks from Medline and Abbott for preferential vendor contracts that overcharged this hospital by approximately 18%. The blood drained from Pierce's face. The board members started asking questions. The hospital's legal counsel was already on the phone with outside counsel. 3 board members who'd supported Pierce's complaint now produced emails showing he'd falsified patient outcome data to justify his resource allocation philosophy. One of them, the CFO, admitted under questioning that Pierce had specifically requested the 7 doctors be pulled from Marcus Reid's case. 7. The number was documented. Orchestrated. Intentional. The Georgia Medical Board received a formal complaint within 48 hours. Not from Katie. From the VA Inspector General's office, backed by the Pentagon investigator's report. Pierce's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His hospital privileges were terminated effective immediately. His attorney negotiated a plea deal within 6 weeks, surrender his license permanently, cooperate with the DEA investigation into his pharmaceutical supplier network, accept felony charges that carried probation instead of prison time. He couldn't practice medicine again. Anywhere. The legal counsel who'd made Katie's termination ironclad now sent her a letter of reinstatement with a job title upgrade. But Katie didn't come back to the regular emergency department. She came back to something new. Something built because 3 of the 7 doctors who'd refused Marcus Reid's case had already transferred to other hospitals. The other 4 were now required to complete mandatory ethics training. Marcus Reid's brother had filed a formal complaint with the VA Inspector General about systematic refusal of care, an investigation that generated local news coverage and forced the hospital's hand. 6 months later, Katie Morrison ran the new Veterans Trauma Unit at Seattle General in Atlanta. 23 beds. A specialized trauma protocol designed for combat-injured patients. A rehabilitation wing attached. And every Tuesday at 1400, Marcus Reid sat on the parallel bars in the physical therapy section, relearning how to walk with bilateral prosthetics, his memory returning in fragments like pieces of a picture slowly reassembling. He remembered the Humvee explosion. Remembered hands pulling him from fire. Remembered a voice saying, "Stay with me, Marine. I've got you." He didn't remember her face because his traumatic brain injury had stolen that, but something about Captain Katie Morrison's presence triggered the tattoo on his forearm. The tattoo he'd gotten the day after they told him someone had carried him 6 miles under fire. A name. Valkyrie 6. His memory was coming back. Not all of it, but pieces. On the wall behind the nurses' station at the new unit, a framed photograph hung in a place of honor. 17 Marines in Baghdad, 2009, Valkyrie 6 in the center, her hand on the shoulder of Sergeant Marcus Reid. Below it, a plaque. And Katie Morrison walked past that photograph every single morning, her jaw set, her hand steady, her voice calm when she issued orders to the 4 doctors now rotating through the unit, learning from her what triage actually meant. One afternoon, 6 months into running the new unit, Katie saw a medical supply van pull up to the hospital loading dock. Gray paint. Pharmaceutical logos on the side. The van belonged to a prison healthcare contractor. A man climbed out. Thin. Diminished. Face weathered by something worse than combat. Dr. Pierce. He was delivering supplies to the lock-up clinic on the hospital's lower level, the only medical work available to someone who'd surrendered his license and served as a cooperating witness in a DEA investigation. He didn't see Captain Katie Morrison standing in the hallway, 30 feet away, watching him carry boxes of bandages and 4 kits down the corridor. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched until he turned the corner, until his presence was gone from her building. Then she walked into the Veterans Trauma Unit, clocked in for her shift, and prepared to see 17 patients before midnight. Some of them had served under her command 16 years ago. Some of them had learned what real triage meant by watching her save Marcus Reid when 7 doctors said no. Marcus took 4 steps on the parallel bars that Tuesday. His best progress yet. Katie didn't smile. Her composure was unchanged. But her son, Daniel, standing in the doorway volunteering after school, saw something shift in her expression, the smallest relaxation of muscles that had been wound tight for 16 years. Something that looked almost like peace. The general stopped by monthly to check on the program. Katie saluted him once. No words necessary. He nodded, the way men do when they understand that some wars are fought in silence, some victories are won with stethoscopes instead of weapons, and some heroes walk among us pushing meds carts at 3 in the morning, healing the people nobody else wanted to save. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear about Katie Morrison's story, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Because Katie's story isn't really about medals or doctors. It's about what happens when you refuse to accept that somebody is hopeless.